I normally don't make videos so haphazardly, but this latest attack on white identity, I think, warrants a response. Britain's Natural History Museum, along with a 3D printing firm, have created this creepy looking model of what they allege is an accurate representation of what inhabitants of Britain looked like about 10,000 years ago. Cheddar Man, as he is called, is a human male fossil found in Goes Cave in Cheddar Gorge, Somerset, England, in 1903, and for some reason they have just now determined that he had dark skin. The same year that they portrayed Achilles as a black man. Coincidence? I think not, but I digress. A team of new male researchers apparently sequenced the Cheddar Man's entire genome, and from that sequence, they learned the ancient man's skin color, eye color, and hair type. Of course, instead of characterizing the alleged finding as a mysterious anomaly and an opportunity to review the ancient history of Europeans, the globalist, pro-white genocide mainstream media used it as an opportunity to attack white and British identity, to push their agenda of mass unfettered non-white invasions into historically white nations, and to spew virulently anti-white, anti-conservative rhetoric. These so-called scientists were also laughably complicit in the media's usage of this finding as a weapon to attack the biological concept of race itself. The leftist media outlet The New Statesman framed the viewpoint that race is biological as imaginary, and only the opinion of white supremacists and racists. Left-wing outlet The Independent went straight for the pro-globalist anti-Brexit propaganda, trying to act as if the alleged fact that a person with dark skin lived in Britain 10,000 years ago means that Britain today should have no control over its borders and allow itself to be invaded and conquered by foreigners. Another article from The Independent made a completely inane reference to the Slimy, a tribe in Wales described by Tacitus over 8,000 years after the Cheddar Man actually lived, and Tacitus described the Slimy as dark-skinned and haired, sharing the same features as Spaniards. However, there are plenty of dark-skinned, curly-haired Europeans of Celtic origin, including the Galicians, the Welsh, the Basque, and the so-called Black Irish. The article goes on to race bait and speak for all Britons in saying that we have been a mixed race since the beginning, then implying that only white supremacists believe that true British people are racially white and ethnically unique, and won't concede that they're mixed with sub-Saharan Africans. And then came the comments by the research team and the 3D printing firm, which were conspicuously similar to the media and its message. Alphonse Kennis, one of the artists that constructed the model of the Cheddar Man, quoted, "People will be surprised. Maybe it will even make immigrants feel a bit more involved in the story. And maybe it gets rid of the idea that you have to look a certain way to be from somewhere. We are all immigrants." Johan Dickman, a computational biologist at University College London, said that the connection often drawn between Britishness and whiteness was not an immutable truth. It has always changed and will change. Dickman went on to say that why Europeans became white and why it happened about 40,000 years after modern humans arrived in Europe are all pretty much open questions. Tom Booth, an archaeologist at the Natural History Museum who worked on the project, believes that the finding shows much more than just what an early Brit looked like. The discovery of Cheddar Man's dark skin shows that these imaginary racial categories that we have are really very modern constructions, or very recent constructions that are not applicable to the past at all. Simon Underwood, an anthropologist at Oxford Brookes University who wasn't even actually involved in the study, told The Independent, "It's a cracking piece of research, and I think the most exciting thing is that it reminds us humans have got a long story, and we all come from somewhere in Africa." Underdown also quoted, "It reminds us that we all come from a relatively small population to begin with. We've all spread out, colonized new places, and done new things. It just challenges this idea we have that certain people belong to certain places, that Britons are Britons are Britons." The media and the academic community are also alluding to the alleged fact that the Cheddar Man had dark skin as proof that he is, in fact, a sub-Saharan African, and that race and skin color are the exact same thing. However, all this research concluded was that Cheddar Man has the genetic markers of skin pigmentation that are usually associated with sub-Saharan Africa. The Guardian, surprisingly enough, had the journalistic integrity to actually concede that the Cheddar Man was actually of Middle Eastern origin, suggesting that his ancestors would have left Africa, moved into the Middle East, and later headed west into Europe. However, the New York Times stated that the new research showed that Cheddar Man belonged to a population known as the Western Hunter-Gatherers, who first migrated to Europe about 14,000 years ago. The same New York Times article stated that humans first arrived in Europe from Africa about 45,000 years ago. This is the out of Africa theory, and that Western hunter-gatherers migrated from the Near East much later. So by their own admission, the humans that the Cheddar Man was descended from were in the Near East and had been out of Africa for over 30,000 years by the time it made its way into Europe and into Britain, allegedly. So after 30,000 years of evolution in the Near East, the people that the Cheddar Man was descended from were no longer sub-Saharan African at all. They had evolved into a different race of people. And while they might have had darker skin features and darker hair, that does not mean that at this point that they were the exact same, genetically or otherwise, as sub-Saharan Africans. Another major logical inconsistency of the media's coverage of this story, as well as the research conducted by the British Natural History Museum, was the failure to mention anything about Neanderthal. The common theory already states that Neanderthals that were forced out of Europe during the last ice age, about 45,000 years ago, interbred with Middle Eastern humans that were already living in that region that had migrated out of Africa. After the glacial maximum, which occurred about 22,000 years ago, the ice sheets retreated and humans migrated into the areas that were once covered by glacial ice sheets, including Britain, which was completely covered by ice sheets during the last ice age, all the way up to about 22,000 years ago. The common theory also states that Neanderthal went extinct in Europe about 47,000 years ago, but some studies have recently shown that they existed in Europe and elsewhere until about 28,000 BC. We also know from archaeological findings all throughout Europe that Neanderthals were fair-skinned, light-haired, and light-eyed, having adapted to the harsh climate of Ice Age Europe to retain as much vitamin D as possible from the scant sunlight. Neanderthal are also known to have carried a variant of the mutated melanocortin-1 receptor that causes red hair and very pale skin in humans. Modern Europeans and Asians also have about 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, whereas Africans have none. Neanderthal males averaged about 164 to 168 centimeters tall, and females averaged 152 to 156 centimeters tall. Studies suggest that their average weight was 77.6 kilograms per your average male and 66.4 kilograms for your average female. And genetic studies have also suggested that some Neanderthals had red or blonde hair, along with a light skin tone. In fact, most Neanderthal genes found in high frequency among modern Europeans are associated with skin pigmentation, or lack thereof, and hair color. More than 66% of modern Europeans carry the gene BNC2, which is strongly associated with skin sensitivity and an increased risk of pre-symptoms of skin cancer. As we can see, the average weight for most Northern Europeans, including the British, are right around the same as Neanderthal, both male and female. The average modern height of both male and female North and Western Europeans and their diasporas are also strikingly similar to Neanderthal. So according to the most popular theory, Neanderthal, with very typical modern-day European features that were being forced out of Europe and into the Middle East due to climate and lack of food, began interbreeding with Cro-Magnon that had migrated out of Africa, that probably had very typical African features, around 45,000 to 60,000 BC. It is then postulated that Middle Eastern Cro-Magnon Neanderthal hybrids expanded and enveloped the remaining prototypical European Neanderthal population within 1,600 generations, that is, 40 to 50,000 years, and further interbreeding with Neanderthal was not extremely common during this replacement. However, this theory by itself seems deeply suspicious, given what we know about the typical Neanderthal genome, their anatomy, their genetic presence in modern-day Europeans, as well as their physical and intellectual capacity in comparison to the invading population of Cro-Magnon Neanderthal hybrids. Neanderthal were typically more robust, slightly shorter, more muscular, and had thicker skeletal structures and joints. Neanderthal had larger cranial capacity and larger brains than did Cro-Magnon Neanderthal hybrids, as larger brains are typical of humans that develop in colder climates. They also had markedly stronger limbs, hands, and feet, and their spine and pelvis bones were wider and stronger. They were also genetically adapted to the cold weather and lack of sunlight, unlike the invading Middle Eastern Cro-Magnon, as I discussed earlier. The ancestors of the Cheddar Man may have been slightly taller, but they were weaker, had smaller brains, and were not genetically adapted to the European climate. And yet somehow these newcomers, according to modern science, replaced the European Neanderthal. The Cheddar Man, similar to the beta male researchers that conducted the study on his DNA, had a slim, almost feminine pelvis. Despite there being mountains of evidence proving the existence of fair-skinned Neanderthals and modern human Neanderthal hybrids for over 50,000 years in Europe, the New York Times claims in the article that they wrote covering the Cheddar Man DNA discovery that research has shown that fair-skin pigmentation, long considered a defining feature of Europe, only goes back less than 6,000 years. Going back to one of the project members' quote about why Europeans became white, Diekman seemingly bases his entire concept of the prototypical Mesolithic European on the finding of the Cheddar Man, as well as this finding in Leon, Spain, that revealed a 7,000-year-old skeleton that matched the description of Cheddar Man almost exactly. From these two findings, Diekman is making a vast assumption that all European populations in the Mesolithic period were uniform in appearance and had the same features as the Cheddar Man and the skeleton found in Leon. Considering the likely extraordinary amount of human biodiversity at the time, in culmination with the nomadic nature of many groups of humans before they began farming and domesticating animals, it would be foolish to assume that populations were not varied in their physical appearances and traits. For instance, the Lepedo child found in Portugal and dating to 24,500 BC was described by scientists as presenting a mosaic of European, early modern human, and Neanderthal features, including fair skin and hair. Another skeleton, known as the Grimaldi man, was found in Italy and dated to the same period. However, the physical characteristics were completely different than even other Cro-Magnon remains found in the same area. These people were described as displaying negroid characteristics, slender and gracile, with some distinct European facial features as well, similar to the findings in Cheddar and Leon. Different genetically unique populations likely inhabited distinct regions, even in the time of the Cheddar Man. But him and some of his people being migrants to Britain is not completely out of the question either. A human genetically similar to the Cheddar Man was found in Spain, and the distance between Somerset, England, and Leon, Spain, could be covered by foot within a month. Likewise, migrating Near Eastern hunter-gatherer groups could journey the distance to Britain within a year, so this does not mean that there were not fair-skinned humans already living in Britain when Cheddar Man's people migrated from the Near East to Britain nearly 14,000 years ago. Remember that Britain was part of a contiguous European landmass and was not an island when Cheddar Man's people migrated here. Moreover, the Cheddar Man was likely killed, as he died in his early 20s, and he had a hole and a massive lesion on the right side of his skull that appears to be the result of a bone infection after being hit with a blunt weapon. He was buried alone, which is not typical of the period, perhaps because he was different than the native population in the area. There is a huge Mesolithic cemetery only 1 mile away that was discovered with over 50 buried in the same place, proving this tradition. There were also other human remains found in the same cave as the Cheddar Man. However, no DNA tests have ever been performed on any of these other skeletons. And the other human remains found in the Go Cave were 5,000 years older than Cheddar Man. Dickman's argument inanely assumes that there was no whites in Europe all the way up to the time of the Indo-European migration in 4000 BC. But it also idiotically declares that the reason why Europeans became white is an open question. This is a willful lie on Dickman's part, for he knows that his thesis of an all-black Mesolithic Europe falls apart completely when the commonly known truth of why Europeans became white is exposed. It was a genetic adaptation to vitamin D deficiency, the same phenomenon that caused the Neanderthal to develop white skin and lighter colors of hair and eyes. Of course, this is not a new theory, and in fact, it isn't even a theory at all. There is evidence to prove that it is a fact. Remember, the Neanderthal subspecies genetically adapted to the European climate over 50,000 years ago to allow for increased absorption of vitamin D, i.e. becoming white. Diekman is essentially claiming that the finding of 2 dark-skinned midgets that lived between 7,000 to 10,000 years ago in Europe proves that Europeans, all Europeans, during this period, somehow found a way around vitamin D deficiency and did not adapt by becoming white. It is such a weak argument, it's almost laughable. The only way humans can obtain enough vitamin D in a climate like Northern or Western Europe, especially during the tail end of an ice age, is sunlight or diet. So either Cheddar Man's people ate nothing but foods rich in vitamin D, like oily fish, to keep from becoming deficient, or they were just very recent migrants from the Near East or Northern Africa, who would have quickly died out if they didn't adapt to the climate, or they would have been wiped out by white humans already living in the area that were not vitamin D deficient. But there are also problems with the argument that ancient dark-skinned peoples obtained their vitamin D exclusively from food sources. A modern study of black children in Uganda showed that vitamin D deficiency was prevalent even in non-malnourished black children living in a tropical climate. Studies have shown that 77% of dark-skinned people that recently migrated to Northern and Western European countries have become vitamin D deficient, even with a warmer modern climate and modern vitamin-rich food sources. The same study showed that dark-skinned migrant pregnant women presented a far higher prevalence of vitamin D deficiency than white pregnant women in Northern and Western European countries. Vitamin D deficiency is not something to be marginalized either. Vitamin D is an essential vitamin, and vitamin D deficiency causes bone fragility, muscle weakness, bone deformities in children like rickets, tooth loss, general malaise, and depression. The Cheddar Man had thin, weak bones and a small stature, probably from generational vitamin D deficiency. And it is safe to assume that any ancient dark-skinned humans that migrated into a climate like ancient England would die out or be wiped out, perhaps before they could even adapt through natural selection by developing fair skin. Considering that the Yamna culture, Indo-European peoples that began migrating into Europe about 6,000 years ago, were also likely olive to brown-skinned and light-eyed, it is ridiculous to assume that early Neolithic Europeans and Western European hunter-gatherers were not also at least marginally fair-skinned, especially when you consider that some of the whitest, fairest-skinned ethnic groups in Europe, like Estonians, Lithuanians, and Belarusians, have the highest percentages of Western European hunter-gatherer DNA of all modern Europeans. Additionally, Southern European ethnic groups that live in a Mediterranean climate, such as the Sardinians, who have the highest percentage of early Neolithic European DNA, on average have the darkest features, but are still distinctively European. Their darker features, in part, can be contributed to the warmer climate in which they lived for millennia, as well as later admixtures of North African genetics into their populations. As mentioned previously, the Yamna culture, the forefathers of the Indo-European languages, are thought to have originated near the Pontic steppe, northwest of the Caspian Sea. Now this is what Indo-Aryan descendants of the Yamna people that stayed in the Near East and migrated into South Asia look like today. The Cheddarman actually resembles a Dravidian or perhaps a Proto-Indo-Aryan more than anything else. The only two human major population groups in the world that have not been classified as either Caucasoid, Negroid, or Mongoloid are the Dravidians and the Sinhalese people of Sri Lanka, both of which have striking resemblances to the Cheddarman. In conclusion, the media and the academic community's interpretation of this finding, as well as the rhetoric that they used in its wake, can be viewed as largely propagandistic in nature. It was also a clear attack on white and British identity, which developed at a time when the population of Britain was almost exclusively white. It is clear evidence that the globalist left-wing empire sees racially white, ethnically white, and nationally white identitarian movements as a threat to their objectives, and should further serve to strengthen the justification and necessity for white identitarianism. It also attacked the biological concept of race and promoted the falsity that skin color is the only determinant of race. It was weaponized by pro-globalist, pro-mass immigration cultural Marxists in an attempt to marginalize white British people's claim to their own nation, as well as their right to protect and secure their own nation from non-white, non-British invaders. By the logic or lack thereof being used by the media and the academic community, specifically that the existence of a dark-skinned person in Britain 10,000 years ago gives modern dark-skinned people a right to the modern nation of Britain, would also mean that white British people, the alleged descendants of black Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, have a right to Africa as well. After all, they would just be reclaiming their ancestral homelands. Previous scientific findings, as well as the clear bias in both the academic and media response to the alleged findings of this study, point to inaccuracy and propaganda. Specifically the fact that the academic community and the media were complicit in a clear anti-white, anti-identitarian, politically driven motive. That the Cheddarman was found 115 years ago and was just now studied in the midst of the current anti-white, pro-globalist political climate. That the Cheddarman was Middle Eastern, not black African, and his people had been in the Middle East for 30,000 years and likely interbred with white Neanderthal before migrating into Europe. That the conclusions were mass assumptions, considering that they were based on only a couple of DNA tests done on Mesolithic Europeans. That these researchers laughably denied the existence of white-skinned people living in Europe before and after the Cheddarman was alive. That human biodiversity was likely prevalent in Europe and elsewhere during the Mesolithic era, and hunter-gatherer populations were nomadic in nature. That Britain could have been reached on foot by dark-skinned people from the Near East or Africa well within one generation. That the Cheddarman was likely killed and atypically buried alone only a mile from a large Mesolithic cemetery where no DNA testing has occurred. That genetic history and biological science has proven that dark-skinned people cannot live for long periods of time in cold and dark climates, like that of late Ice Age Europe, without suffering from vitamin D deficiency and dying out or being destroyed. That the finding of a skeleton with similar DNA and physical features in Leon, Spain, in 2014 did not produce an anti-white propagandist attack on Spanish racial or ethnic identity. And finally, that Europeans with the largest amount of Western hunter-gatherer DNA are some of the palest ethnic groups in modern-day Europe.